Murdock's Music Minute is back in 2025. As you can see, there's still a little bit of the Christmas decoration hanging. The reason for that is I'm recording this in 2024. But anyways, imagine you are to introduce somebody interested in music to one of the most famous rock band slash progressive rock bands of all times, Pink Floyd. Which 3 to 5 albums would you choose as an easy to get into introduction to the band? That's the question I'm asking myself, sometimes with various artists and bands. And today it's getting into episode number 5, Pink Floyd, which means I have picked 5 albums from the Pink Floyd discography that I think are a good way to get into the Pink Floyd discography. So that means I'm not necessarily picking the critically acclaimed albums, the darlings of the critics, but often, of course, there are the most essential albums also included in my little list of getting into albums. And I've restricted myself, or I've given myself a few additional rules to this little game, so to say. It should be really regular studio albums, so no compilations or archival releases. I might do live albums with some bands, we will see. So that's rule number 1. And rule number 2, no double albums, even if there are some really classic double albums in a band's discography. Think of maybe Led Zeppelin or the Beatles or even Pink Floyd. I will never choose double albums as albums to introduce a band to somebody to. So enough of the technical details, the house rules. So what are my 5 picks to get into Pink Floyd? Pink Floyd, the great innovators in sound, in experimentation, in rock music, arena rock bands deluxe. For a lot of fans, they are one of the biggest prog rock bands. Other critics still argue whether Pink Floyd are proper progressive rock or not. Some talk of Pink Floyd as a space rock band, an early space rock band, and of course their roots definitely were in a more avant-garde psychedelic sound that you can especially hear on the first 2 to 3 albums. After a really impressive, fascinating debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, they, for a couple of years and albums, were really out in the wilderness trying to find their sound. Main reason for that, obviously, was the loss of their band leader and main songwriter, Syd Barrett, who struggled with both drug intake, lots of LSD, etc., but mostly also mental problems, probably triggered by his drug consumption. However, it's very likely that his disposition for these personality disorders had already been there before. Anyways, the band at one point decided it wasn't possible to play with Barrett anymore, and also Barrett maybe just was waiting, at least unconsciously or subconsciously was waiting to be released from the burden of being a pop star. So whatever the truth, he wasn't really fired, but the band at one point simply decided not to pick him up anymore, and Barrett somehow never looked back. From then on, they had to find new songwriters amongst their own ranks. So all of the band members more or less tried their hands at songwriting. And this led to very uneven, but at the same time, often also very interesting albums, still very much in a psychedelic vein, a psychedelic sound, increasingly more experimental even. What I'm getting at is that my first pick is not the famous debut album, which is, as I've mentioned, a really fascinating, but sometimes also maybe a bit odd and challenging listen, because Barrett also was a fan of quite freeform jam sessions. My number one, my first pick to still get a feel of the early Pink Floyd is, in fact, their second studio album, A Saucerful of Secrets, released in 1968 at a point where the band, for a brief moment in time, consisted of two guitarists, the more or less non-functioning Syd Barrett, and a new guy, an old friend of the band, David Gilmour, who, of course, very soon became one of the best-known members in the band. So A Saucerful of Secret really sees them at this transitional point in their history. At this juncture, they were somehow trying to recreate the sound or cling on to the Syd Barrett sound of their debut, when Barrett wasn't really delivering the songs anymore, and the other band members had to step in and train their songwriting muscles. And the result is, maybe for some, an uneven, as I've mentioned, an uneven hodgepodge of psychedelic songs with sometimes almost ambient, meditative approaches. The title track is sort of a three-part instrumental, not really very connected to each other, those three parts. And yeah, a good example of the sometimes experimentation for experimentation's sake attitude in the early Pink Floyd. But you also get a lot of really charming early space rock, psych rock tracks on this album. The album opener, for example, Let There Be More Light, starts with a really gripping guitar lick and then becomes one of those rather meandering, psychedelic, spacey songs that Pink Floyd were really good at in the early years. A lot of critics and fans point to the track Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, written by Roger Waters, which again is a very mysterious, slowly flowing, meandering, psychedelic, quite repetitive, almost trance-inducing song. A good example of early psychedelic space rock. And then you get some very English, a bit eccentric, a bit quaint tracks like Corporal Clegg. Those tracks definitely try to revive the spirit of Syd Barrett. However, in Corporal Clegg, you also get one of Roger Waters' favorite topics, and that's dealing with war and the consequences of war and what it does to the people who fought in the war, but still in a very caricature, very quaint Alice in Wonderland style. Rick Wright, the keyboard player, also handed in a few rather dreamy, tranquil, more maybe pop-influenced psychedelic tracks, Remember a Day and Seesaw. His contributions on the early Pink Floyd albums often are seen as maybe lesser or filler material. I think Remember a Day is a fantastic, psych pop song, very much in the style of Syd Barrett, and Seesaw also is a quite charming, easy listening, psychedelic Baroque pop track. So that's a saucer full of secrets for you, which really is a bag of psychedelic secrets. My album number 2 for beginners in the Pink Floyd discography is 1971's Metal. Still maybe part of that, trial and error phase of the band, but this one certainly consolidated their sound a good bit. And while some argue this is the last of their we're not really knowing where we should go next phase, others say this is the first of their really span of classic albums. And certainly this sounds more confident, more thought through, and more maybe also muscular in a certain way than the albums before this one, which were really a lot of trial and error, tinkering around with strange ideas for sound experiments, or also embryonic songwriting. Metal still is maybe a bit uneven or simply a collection of songs as opposed to the huge concept or at least thematic albums that the band did afterwards. But this is just a charming album that falls somewhere between psychedelic rock, classic rock, and progressive rock. It starts with a very urgent, almost dark instrumental called One of These Days. Also demonstrates the great love for sound and sound experimentation, which was always Pink Floyd's forte. An echo effect on the bass, modified vocals, sounds all very strange. But at the same time, this is also one of the hardest rocking and one of the fast-paced songs in Floyd's discography. Then you get a number of more laid back, almost acoustic, folk-influenced songs. A Pillow of Winds is a very beautiful love ballad by Dave Gilmour, but in a tranquil, psychedelic style. A bit of fun with songs like Saint-Tropez and Seamus. And then on side 2, one of the really essential epic tracks by Pink Floyd, possibly the longest track they ever released on a studio album, either this one or Atom Heart Mother. I'm not sure. But yeah, this one takes up the entire second half of the album, and it's a journey through sounds and various parts. The first maybe proper prog rock song that Pink Floyd ever put onto tape, and it's really a fantastic track for lovers of space rock or prog rock, or those who want to become fans of Pink Floyd. And that's why I definitely put Metal into my list of getting into Pink Floyd albums. But bigger things were ahead for the band and for the listeners. And my next pick is an album I couldn't do without, possibly in such a list. Fans would probably otherwise go out and lynch me. Of course, I'm talking about one of the most famous rock albums in the history of rock music, one of the most successful albums in the history of recorded music, and also the album that Pink Floyd is best known for. And of course, that's The Dark Side of the Moon, starting with its iconic cover album. The soundscapes that fade in at the beginning of this album, and the entire atmosphere, the way this album is recorded, pristine recording and mixing, great use of sound effects and sounds of everyday objects, most notably on the track Time, which opens with the sounds of ticking clocks and chiming clocks, all wonderfully mixed by none other than Alan Parsons. So this was the big moment in Floyd's career where, for maybe the first time, or certainly the first time since their debut album, they managed to come up with an album that is more than the sum of its parts. And maybe this is also, in general, Pink Floyd's most cohesive album. It has a great flow from beginning to end. It can be argued whether this is a true concept album or rather an album that is held together by certain themes in the lyrics, and definitely held together by a certain sound aesthetic. It definitely has a very progressive touch or style or attitude, but this is not progressive rock in the style of bands like Yes or Emerson, Lake and Palmer, with tracks that find no ending. You also haven't got the endless soloing or influences from classical music or some kind of self-indulgent fantasy lyrics. This is rather progressive in the way that sounds are used and that the studio is used to create a more cerebral rock music, maybe. Definitely an album everybody knows, or also beginners in classic rock should listen to at least once in their life. And my number 3 in the list of getting into Pink Floyd albums. This is followed by, at my number 4, I'm always going chronologically through these lists, so it's not a ranking or a best of. At number 4, the follow-up album, much anticipated by critics and listeners, because with The Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd had moved on from being this underground, slightly weird experimental band to becoming huge classic rock stars, filling arenas and stadiums around the world. Also, their live shows became more and more extravagant with, special effects and visuals in the background, etc. So they followed up The Dark Side of the Moon with an album that was equally progressive, maybe even a little bit proggier than The Dark Side of the Moon. Arguably not as instantly accessible maybe as The Dark Side of the Moon, but definitely equally interesting, and maybe in terms of the music even more interesting than The Dark Side of the Moon. But anyways, I'm talking about Wish You Were Here, the second of the big classic Pink Floyd albums. Opens with a long, sweeping, floating instrumental, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, which features one of David Gilmour's very minimalist but iconic guitar themes, guitar licks. This album overall is a bit melancholic and pensive. It deals with two different topics at the same time, one being loss, and definitely the loss of their former friend and bandleader Syd Barrett had a huge influence on the lyrics and the overall atmosphere of this album. Shine On You Crazy Diamond very much is an open ode, maybe a love letter or a letter of support to Syd Barrett. And the other theme that runs through the album is a more cynical one, the territory of Roger Waters maybe, and that is criticizing the often harsh and cynical world of the music industry and the pressure of being stars, or being the stars that your manager or your record label wants you to be. So not really a concept album, this one, but definitely dealing with specific issues and topics. On this album, you also have a great use of keyboards and early synthesizer sounds. It sounds maybe a bit colder, a bit more detached than The Dark Side of the Moon. But in the middle, then, you have the famous title track, which is a down-to-earth rock ballad starts with acoustic guitars, wonderful guitar playing by David Gilmour again. It's an almost very simple campfire strumming type a song if you break it down to its very core and essence. It may be one of Pink Floyd's warmest and most heartfelt songs ever. Interestingly, on this sometimes a bit dark or cynical album. Both these albums, The Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here, were million sellers, two of Pink Floyd's biggest successes, critically and commercially. So what's pick number 5 now? There aren't too many studio albums left that were released under the name of Pink Floyd. After Wish You Were Here, which could be considered the last real band effort of Pink Floyd, Roger Waters became more and more dominant. There were personal troubles for some of the band members. Rick Wright, for example, went through a divorce, but also there was a rift between the band members, and from then on it was more of a fight of egos, and at some point the band simply fell apart or didn't want to work with each other anymore. That's a simplified version of the things that happened in the late 70s and the early 80s. Then Roger Waters started doing some solo albums. David Gilmour wanted to go solo. Richard Wright released at least one solo album during the 1980s, and it seemed to be impossible for all the members to come back and work as Pink Floyd. Indeed, there was a huge legal feud over who was allowed to use the name Pink Floyd, and it was more or less Roger Waters versus the rest of the band, and that's the status we still have today. The feud, the fights between especially David Gilmour and Roger Waters have continued to this day. But back in 1987, Pink Floyd released another album under the name of Pink Floyd, featuring David Gilmour, Nick Mason, the drummer, and Richard Wright, who originally was only credited as a co-musician on this album, but without Roger Waters. And this was more or less the final stage of the Pink Floyd history. And that's my pick number 5. The album released in 1987, A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Not a very popular album, even among Floyd fans, because, there is no Roger Waters. There is no overarching concept to this album. Waters' often biting lyricism definitely is missing. And this album suffered from the fate of so many rock albums in the 1980s. It has a very slick, glossy 1980s production. And that's a problem for a lot of Pink Floyd fans. The album hence has been remastered and sounds a lot better if you are not a fan of the very plasticky, very sterile 1980s sound. Maybe get the remaster. But listening more closely to this, actually, there are a couple of really fine songs on this album. A Momentary Lapse of Reason probably is the closest Pink Floyd ever came to doing a mainstream pop rock album. There are still a lot of traces of the spheric floating soundscapes Pink Floyd had become loved for, and also some of their progressive leanings. But overall, A Momentary Lapse of Reason is quite accessible 1980s pop rock. You definitely get a lot of blistering guitar work from David Gilmour, so fans of Gilmour's singing guitar sound will get very happy with a lot of the material on this album. It's the maybe a bit more watered down, no pun intended, or the softer, the more commercial David Gilmour version of Pink Floyd, and the album even featured or contains some radio-friendly songs such as Learning to Fly or On the Turning Away. The former one is, yeah, it's a catchy pop rock song, and the latter one is the unexpected, great Lighters in the Air ballad in the Pink Floyd catalog. But yeah, it's radio friendly material that's quite enjoyable to listen to, actually. Yeah, with the help of several external songwriters or co-songwriters, Gilmour somehow brought or carried the Pink Floyd ship through the 80s and even into the 90s. So there we have it, 5 albums that I would recommend for beginners of Pink Floyd, for people who are just getting into the Pink Floyd studio canon. As always, some of my favorites are not featured in this list, simply because I think they are not the best starting point with this band. But maybe you disagree or agree with me. Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and stick around for more Murdock Music Minutes as always. Cheers.